This is Say It Loud. Buckle your seatbelts and get ready to immerse yourself in the complexities of our government. In 3, 2, 1, blast off.
Welcome to Say It Loud. This is Danush, and we're joined by Maria, Leica, Archit, and Arav. And we're also joined by Shaurya Shrivastava from Unit 4. Today we're going to be talking about the First Amendment and the effects of social media on it. Does anyone want to begin?
So, as the modern technology has evolved, we have the rise of social media. The understanding of free expression has definitely changed on online platforms. So, what do you guys think the role of the social media companies is in regulating free expression nowadays?
So the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act basically prevents social media companies from having liability of the things that are said on their platforms. This was intended to kind of promote free speech, where instead of being forced to censor things at their discretion, social media companies can kind of claim immunity from the things being said on their platform, which then allows people to say more things that are controversial and stuff, and then kind of have this discourse around certain things, which is obviously beneficial to kind of a general society. But the other side of this argument would then just be since social media companies are not held liable, they don't regulate things when hate speech occurs, when dangerous things occurs.
Yeah, I think I side more with the other side of the story, which is yes, free speech should obviously be allowed on, there should be more leeway for free speech on social media platforms, but social media companies should still be held accountable for dangerous posts. For example, if a user posts something about terrorism and kind of incites a terrorist attack, the social media company should also be held accountable for allowing that type of speech to occur on their platform.
So which method of filtration do you think works best? Should it be real people looking at this? Should it be algorithms that do this autonomously? How do you think we best implement these censorship in a way?
I don't think that it's really possible to have real people looking at every post and flagging it to take it down. I think that there should be some automation in this realm of social media, and I think yes, there should be some automation of censoring these hateful speech activities, but there should also be some sort of personal, if something's kind of on the fence, and there should be some other person who comes in and says, oh yeah, this should be censored, this shouldn't be censored.
Yeah, and I agree with Arav, and we've kind of seen the dangers of having a person censor content on social media platforms. We're following the Cambridge Analytica scandal. A bunch of other controversies around Facebook popped up, and one of those people was former Facebook employees speaking up, former content moderators, speaking about how they were subjected to see things such as acts of hurting a child and basically traumatic events that even after they've left their job at Facebook still haunt them. And I think that by implementing some other avenue without a person, it would allow for the moderators to not experience these things.
So earlier you said that companies should be doing more to regulate hate speech and harmful content. Do you think that doing more should be going beyond what's already protected or not protected by the First Amendment, or do you think that companies have a part of their mission should be to regulate content beyond for example, hate speech is not protected under the First Amendment?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I don't think that companies they're not forced to by the law follow do anything more than the First Amendment. And if they say that they want to follow the First Amendment, then I think they should be held accountable of following the First Amendment. But there's some speech that are still being posted on social media that don't meet the standards of free speech that should be actually censored on these social media platforms, and these social media platforms should be doing a job of taking down that speech rather than just taking down speech that they don't necessarily agree with.
Another interesting area is misinformation. Although this is protected traditionally under the First Amendment, due to the nature of social media being used as a source of media, you had companies such as Meta who had these fact checkers autonomously deleting misinformation, but which are now gone. Do you guys think fact checkers and misinformation should be taken down from social media?
I think it's a self-fulfilling thing in that if social media companies promise to not propagate misinformation, then their user base, if they're promising that to the user base, then yes, they do have a vested interest or need to do that or reduce misinformation. But if someone is using a social media app with the knowledge that the content on here is not regulated, might be fake, then I think that's up to the user to make that choice to use such a platform.
And kind of to encapsulate like Ara's response and Arch's idea, I disagree, and I don't think that like having social media companies regulate is necessarily the best idea, especially in the recent 2024 decisions of NetChoice v. Paxton's and Moody v. NetChoice. The court essentially holds that social media companies and other private companies similar to it have editorial discretion to host or not host content at their site at their own will. If we think about this in kind of like a grander scheme, this leads down to a slippery slope where social media companies can remove content they don't like, even if it's not bound by the First Amendment.
But then if you think about it, again, we have to remember that social media companies are private companies, right? And so we can't equate it to the government, but I think an argument could be made that maybe we should be adopting the state action doctrine to social media as well, so that they're a public platform almost.
Well, I wanted to jump in, and I just wanted to ask if you guys think government should have any role in regulating social media companies, because we talk a lot about, we don't know how social media companies, what are they going to classify as hate speech, what are they going to classify as misinformation. That's up to the discretion of whoever runs the social media companies. But do you think that government agencies should be involved in regulating these social media companies, or could we have the same slippery slope if this was the case?
I think that you would actually not be achieving what you wanted if you're having government involvement, because once the government is involved, there's actually less speech that could be theoretically removed, because First Amendment protections are usually very broad. And so I think that hate speech, for example, the government can't regulate that content because that content is protected by the First Amendment. And so I think involving the government would actually make it harder to regulate speech beyond what's protected by the First Amendment.
I disagree with Leica. I think the government does have a role in regulating social media, but not necessarily the content, but the companies themselves. We see in recent years that the Federal Trade Commission has been going against monopolies like Google for their advertising. And as we see moving to the modern day, we only have a few large social media platforms: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, those kind of things. And the danger in having these monopolized social media companies is the singular voice, and it becomes so powerful that these social media companies are too powerful and constantly regulate companies. By having the government step in preventing and regulating the companies themselves and not the content, I think this can be an effective solution.
Well, to directly answer your question, Shaurya, in the 2024 Supreme Court case Murthy v. Missouri, the Supreme Court ruled that the government should have little to no interaction with these social media companies. The case revolved around Biden's censorship of COVID-19 and vaccine misinformation, but the court believed that this could lead to a slippery slope of increased government, for lack of a better word, entanglement in these private companies, as if they were pressured into deleting these misinformation.
I'm gonna go back to what Leica was saying. She's talking about the tests that that are on the First Amendment to censor some information. Do you think that these tests are still proper tests, are still good through social media with the advent of social media?
No, and I think one of the primary ways we can see this was with the Miller test, because one of the prongs includes the community standards, but with the increased prevalence of social media and its wide breadth, how do you define community? Is it the community in which the individual tweet or post was made? Is it the reach? It's really difficult to define for obscenity, which is what the Miller test deals with.
So you think that there should be a national standard for obscenity then?
I agree, yeah.
To the point Archie is saying that there should be different ones. I would sort of agree in that, for example, if you have true threats or clear and present danger, where the immediate nature of such a threat is very important, but when things are posted online, that is much harder to to estimate. So I think that either these tests should not be obsolete, but rather should be adapted to the social media age, in which there is less emphasis on that immediate nature of these threats.
Yeah, but I think that the disregarding the value of social media, because I think what you're getting at is when someone behind a computer screen tweets oh, I hate Joe Biden, I'm gonna kill him tomorrow. That's not necessarily taken as seriously as someone that goes in front of the White House and says that, right? But I think that kind of creates a problem where we see in recent school shootings the the perpetrators of these shootings have histories of violence on social media, especially, right? But it's being like ignored because social media at this point isn't being taken seriously. But I think if we like reevaluate the context, and like it's not about the test itself, but that the way we view what is imminent and what is not in that sense.
Wait, yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of getting at the point where, like, I agree with you in that we have to restructure, like, what we think as, like you said, what is imminent or not, and we have to consider, like, further into the future than, like...
So what would you guys say is imminent then?
I think that imminency has to be reevaluated on a case-by-case basis. It's hard to define, like, one particular standard. I think one thing that people go back to a lot is in Trump's, like, his like rally after the 2020 election. He told his supporters that they needed to fight like hell, and then afterwards the supporters stormed the Capitol. Whether that was an imminent threat or not, and the supporters were motivated by his words, or he was kind of just like saying like metaphorically that they need to fight, is like something that highlights how like difficult it is to discern what imminent exactly means.
So when you say case-by-case basis, do you mean evaluate potentially based on like the potential outreach of Trump versus just a random person posting on the internet? Like, how do we define like the individual scenario?
Well, I think that the idea is that Trump's speech that we must fight like hell has more of an impact and is more of a threat because it can reach a larger population. Yeah. For example, if I say after the 2024 election or 2020 election that we must fight like hell, that's not going to really do anything because I don't really have that power and that like sway on the people. But Trump's comments after that election and on January 6th could be considered an imminent threat because of like the amount of people that he could persuade to go and then riot at the Capitol.
Yeah, because I agree with Ara. I think because one part of that, like evaluating that, is like likely to incite such action. So I think that likely part would depend on the context. So yeah.
So bringing up another question, what do you guys think social media has had as an effect on the political process?
I think that's a great question, Danush, and we see this most recently in the latest 2024 election, with especially the new advent of Kamala HQ, which came in the summer of 2024, kind of following more trends to appeal to the younger generations. They debuted as themed, kind of as Charlie XCX's Brat theme, and I think that by political figures joining social media, it's a great way for younger voters to get engaged in the political process, which, especially for the Democratic Party, younger voters is important for them to win their elections.
I think that we can see the effect of this even like throughout this election. Obviously, like historically, the younger voters have been more Democratic, but in this past election, a lot of young men specifically started to vote for Republican candidate Donald Trump. And I think part of this is because Donald Trump did go through so many measures to reach out to these younger men, because through, like, for example, a podcast through Joe Rogan and other places.
Yeah, like kick streams with Aiden Ross and outreach. Also, I wanted to bring up how social media is also dangerous to the political process because it has the algorithms which just feed polarized content to these people, and in a sense, social media, rather than providing relevant information, is like an echo chamber and can be dangerous to the political diversity.
But I wanted to push back on that, Archit. You mentioned the dangers of social media, and while I completely agree with you, I wanted to ask, like, you think traditional media is really any better than social media? You think traditional media is going to give more of a balanced perspective on news?
I think traditional media does give a more balanced perspective on the news, simply because of like the algorithms that social media hold. Going back to Arch's point, and kind of like, for example, Joe Rogan and Aiden Ross, that Ara mentioned, is what is traditionally now dubbed as red pilled like content, right? That by constantly consuming this content and then having Trump appear in this content, you're stuck in this cycle of Joe Rogan, Aiden Ross, and Trump and on social media. And this is kind of just the view you constantly have, where traditional media doesn't constantly feed you this stuff, and you're free to explore other sources if you want. But on social media with these algorithms, you don't have that choice.
I agree with Maria, and because like more generally, like social media is user-generated content in which it's not just political figures posting, but it's like you and me and like everyone else like feeding into that algorithm, versus like traditional media is generally like more like reputable, like, or like licensed, or like editors, journalists, for example, that the content is a bit more curated, but you don't have like the user-generated aspect that causes a lot of that misinformation and polarization.
But I kind of agree with like what Shaurya is saying, because like you like to give your point, like there's a level of trust in these traditional media outlets that isn't in social media, for example. So for example, when I see like something stupid on social media, I don't really like trust it, but if I see something stupid on traditional media outlets, I'll be like, oh yeah, that might be true. And I do think that nowadays, especially, that these traditional media outlets are taking a very polarized stance that even might cross into the lines of, that blur the lines of misinformation, and that actually does have a larger impact than social media, for example.
I agree, but again, like if we're thinking about like a demographic of like a young demographic, then I do think like we're like underestimating the amount of people who actually like would think like, oh, like this is not real, I'm not believing it. But I do like see like your point, like more generally, yes. But yeah.
Well, I wanted to kind of push back on your guys' points. If, for example, like Infowars, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of that. It's run by Alex Jones, who's like a big conspiracy theorist. He's promoted conspiracy about Sandy Hook and 9/11, and his website had over 10 million monthly users. 10 million, and that would be under the umbrella of traditional media. So traditional media often has, well, I don't know if it's like, well, the people who use it would consider it traditional media. Obviously, probably not us, but so oftentimes traditional media does have quite a slant, and you could argue that on social media you may find more perspectives or be exposed to new perspectives. For example, on TikTok, a lot of people were exposed to, for example, like a lot of people who were pro-Palestine posted a lot of content on social media that traditional media didn't really give the perspective of to.
Well, TikTok is also the primary cause of like the rise of Andrew Tate. No, so like it goes both ways. That like you have social media that promotes like varied point of views, but then you also have like social media that perpetuates kind of like the cycle of like red pilled content, where people find Andrew Tate, they like one video, and then the algorithm thinks that they like more videos and then recommend more videos, and that's how the cycle starts, right? And yes, it does generate new perspectives, but then once you get hooked, it's kind of hard to escape it.
I don't think it's fair to like categorize like one perspective as like quote unquote good and one perspective as quote unquote bad, because social media algorithm is just giving you the perspective that you seemingly interact with, right?
That's true, but it like Maria said, like it feeds that, like that's why like you get so like even if you were like initially like moderate, like that content you get like over and over again, and that can like push you to the extreme. Versus, for example, like something like Infowars is like if you're like subscribing to something like that, that's like an action that you're taking, like versus like social media is like more autonomous. Like you're not actively like searching for this content, but it's being fed to you. Versus like media sources like Infowars or other like similar like things, like those are things that you seek out and like you continue to consume. If that makes sense.
But like in terms of like the election, I'm talking about like the election, this past election between Republicans and Democrats. If social media, I don't think that's like necessarily. I think that is true that social media is subconsciously giving you that information, but I think that same thing is happening even in traditional news outlets. For example, when I open Google, for example, like I already have like suggested news articles from like my favorite media outlets. So I think that social media is subconsciously doing that, but I think also traditional news has that same subconscious.
But you just cited another engine that uses algorithms. I don't think
so
that's
maybe
fair.
Like the thing, it's not social media versus traditional media. Maybe it's just like the rise of like user-based like algorithms that's feeding like personalized like suggestions, whether it be news, like TV, like whatever. Maybe it's just like the system itself of like the
I think
rise of
Waco's
AI.
referencing like newspapers. Like if you wanted to subscribe to like the NBC newspaper or whatever, that's like you have to consciously think, okay, NBC's slightly left leaning, so I'm going to subscribe to this beforehand. Whereas if you click on one NBC article just because, now you're going to be continuously fed this left wing or right wing, etc.
Well, let me ask you.
It's like the method of like getting your information, like regardless of what kind of media. Like I was saying, like is it being fed to you, or are you seeking out that?
Well, let me ask a question then. Like, do you really think that there's a way to have a diverse array of opinions be presented to you in this age? Even if you look to traditional media, social media, television, like, is there any way we can have a diverse view or range of opinions that are being fed to us, or are we always going to have our own subconscious biases that play into what we watch, what we read?
I see like two ways it could go. One way is like if you're being passive about it and you're not like actively interacting with media, then yes, you're gonna be getting more neutral content. But on the second hand, like if you are like someone who wants diverse viewpoints, then yes, you're gonna seek out those kind of sources. You're gonna like look at like different kinds of like reels, for example, like on different topics. So like I think it comes down to you. But yes, if you're seeking confirmation for whatever you believe in, then yes, you're not gonna get diverse.
Wait, I disagree with like, and I think even if you're seeking diverse viewpoints, you won't be able to, because your theory entirely relies on people being like passive and just actively trying to seek out like what they want to see. But you never like see people searching like, oh, today I want to watch right-leaning like content on like TikTok, right?
I mean, yeah,
like,
it's not like it's more like theoretical than like.
yeah, but like practically,
yeah.
you're just gonna be watching what's on your for you page and what's on your like Instagram reels, you know. And sometimes like you get the like occasional like whatever like trad wife reel or whatever, but then you're like, I don't want to watch this, and then you scroll away and they don't like recommend it to you, so then like you're just like stuck in like your single viewpoint.
All right, so that will conclude our podcast today on social media. We touched on how the First Amendment relates to social media with censorship, hate speech, misinformation, and lastly, how algorithms have changed the political process and how we consume our media. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. That was Say It Loud with Arav, Maria, Leka, Arkuth, and Danush.